Hi everyone, this is Rohit from Rise and Mastery, and today I'm excited to have Simon Holland, who's the founder of Vance. Vance is an AI back office service for starters and SMBs that handle business obligations. It's like having a top tier admin and ops manager. A big thanks to Clem for the introduction. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it, Rohit.
Awesome. So, you have a interesting journey. I've met with, Clem a couple of times, but, before we start about your journey into startups, how was your childhood? You got a very interesting childhood. You've been all over the world, but how did that impact you? And, what got you interested into this crazy world of startups?
Yeah, and I really think that my childhood actually was part of my entrepreneurial journey. I think that's really what made me want to be an entrepreneur and maybe contribute to some of the stuff that I've done. But I was originally born in Peru, in South America, in a city called Cusco. And my parents are both British, and basically spent my childhood traveling between Peru, Australia, and then went to actually an international school in Barcelona called the Benjamin Franklin International School, and that's where I finished high school. So yeah, kind of grew up all over the place, and then ended up going to Australia and going to college and dropped out in my final year of college as entrepreneurs do to start my first business. So yeah, that's a bit of my kind of upbringing, and I guess having so much exposure to different cultures and people and constantly having to meet new people because I had to move from place to place, I guess made me really adaptable and kind of gave me that kind of that social networking kind of openness and adaptability that has come to be very useful in business.
Interesting. And you've been part of multiple businesses, like Ellie, Hot Dog, VV, Papercloud. How did you was it a conscious decision to look at, multiple different ventures, and maybe you can talk about, the first business that you did.
Absolutely. So I always wanted to be super entrepreneurial. I mean, I think in high school it started where I'd sell different things in high school. I mean, I sold sandwiches, I sold different types of tickets and IDs and a whole bunch of different things in high school. Any opportunity to really kind of, I guess, make money. So that was always kind of entrepreneurial drive I had. But I guess, when I was in college, I started my first business, and that is actually Papercloud. So Papercloud was a digital product development company essentially. So we're based in Melbourne, Australia. We had about 25 team members, and we'd basically work with startups and also large corporates on building out their digital products for them. So this was back around 2011 when we started this company, when really mobile and web apps were really taking off, and that gave me really good exposure to realizing that wow, there's a lot of opportunity out there, and always I wanted to start multiple businesses. I maybe my attention span or something along those lines, but I love creating businesses. I think it's taking something from nothing to creating something that has an impact on people's lives is has been really rewarding. And yeah, that's kind of what drove me to kind of start different businesses, but also being very opportunistic as well. We met some fantastic partners, some co-founders, like for example, Ben Hurst co-founded Hot Dog with him and Tom Spacek, and then Lior Rauchberger co-founded Vivi. So yeah, just really good people along the journey and met different people to essentially start these different companies. And I've always been very opportunistic. So yeah, why not build a big portfolio of companies from the ground up and go through the hard yards essentially.
Nice, interesting. And, I've got a couple of Australian entrepreneurs who come on the podcast, but how's the ecosystem in Melbourne and Sydney versus, say, that of here in London?
Yeah, so I guess I mean, so I guess Australia, I haven't lived in Australia for about 5 years, 6 years. I was living in the US, but I'm still
Hmm.
pretty in touch with what's going on there. And I think, especially, in the last kind of, I guess, decade, Australian tech has really started to kind of boom. I mean, there's so many fantastic Australian entrepreneurs. If you look at the population size versus some of the big companies that have come out of it, I mean, look at amazing companies like Canva, for example, or Atlassian, and there's a ton of other companies that have, really come out of Australia. I think naturally Australians, good entrepreneurs, but it's also a good testing ground for creating a company and then moving it to, let's say, the US or moving it to Europe or the UK essentially. So it's definitely been, building and building and building. Maybe not quite the extent of the US, but it's like any country, that they're kind of trying to emulate that kind of tech boom in the US. But now I'm in London and definitely been exposed to the London, I guess, yeah, ecosystem, which has been fantastic. I actually was at a VC dinner the other day, and somebody mentioned a startup that exited for $700 million in the UK, and that seems like a big deal for the UK. But then for the US, it's not a big deal, and it's just still kind of like Australia as well a little bit. We do have obviously in Australia a number of companies that have, billion dollars plus, but it starts to get pretty narrow numbers after that point. And yeah, I mean, that's why I'm so excited about the US market, and I love the US market, and why I lived in the US is because that's where you can really create really compelling, amazing companies. And I think you can now do that from overseas as well. You don't necessarily have to be located in the US. I think you can have team members there as long as the time zones are okay.
Hmm. Got it. Got it. Interesting. And I want to talk about Vance. What's the thesis behind Vance, and why do you want to focus on SMBs and startups to start with?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few reasons for that. I guess, why do we want to focus on SMBs and startups? It's because, I mean, decision making is really very quick. The sales cycle is really short. You can, go in with a PLG approach, so, product-led growth approach. And, if you get that combination right, it's a really fantastic market. I guess, going for enterprise, there's a lot more requirements, and typically quite expensive to build out a pretty strong sales team. And I guess personally, I love working with SMBs because, really supporting that ecosystem. And with Vance, we thought, well, how can we support the SMB market? Because, the SMBs don't have the resources of, enterprise. So how can we kind of help provide them with the types of, I guess, resources, or at least help them compete potentially against enterprise by providing, things like the services that Vance offers.
Got it. And do you think the 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 definition of enterprise versus mid market is different here in Europe versus US? Like somebody pointed out that it's mid market is about 1,000 employees out here in the Europe, but in US it's totally different. I could be wrong. Maybe you would know more about it.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, I think that the kind of the number of, I guess, employees, which is typically the measure, although I kind of think it should be based on revenue to a certain extent. It definitely differs from Europe to the US and from Australia. I mean, in the US, mid-market companies typically 500 employees. I believe, in Europe and Australia, it's probably 200 plus. So, it's just that kind of those different variances there. But yeah, I mean, so it's also pretty subjective as well. I think, what is mid-market, what is SMB? It's almost how the actual company or the startup actually, I guess, classifies each different category. But yeah, it seems as though they categorize it slightly different in the US.
Correct. And when it comes to SMBs, I can always think about HubSpot, which focused on SMBs rather than Salesforce is focused on enterprises, and they've been very successful. And when it comes to SaaS companies, do you think they would need to transition to selling to enterprises, or can they uh, be focused on selling to starters and SMBs to be like a unicorn, decacorn, which HubSpot went on to be?
Yeah, I mean, HubSpot's a great example. They've done extremely well. Take companies like Gusto, for example, fantastic business. Take businesses like QuickBooks and Zero. There's a number of really fantastic businesses that have managed to scale super quickly by targeting SMBs. And I think that some of those businesses decide to go up market to enterprise, but some decide just to stay in SMB. I mean, if you look at the size of the SMB market in the US, there's 32 million SMBs in the US, essentially.
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that SMBs are spending more than enterprise. I believe enterprise spend about 55% of the total SaaS spend in the US, and I believe it's around 40 or 45% is spent by kind of SMBs mid-market. But it just shows that there's two different markets with very different approaches, essentially. And especially as an early stage company, targeting SMBs in a way is easier to a certain extent because they have much less, shorter sales cycles, but much, I guess, more lenient requirements as well. I think typically when companies go up to enterprise, there's a huge amount of things they need to do from a kind of compliance and a security perspective and just different grades of tooling and permissions and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, I think that you can build great businesses in both the enterprise space and the SMB space, but you can also move up market and you can also move down market as well.
Got it. And just want to follow up on that. When do you think a company should decide to move up market and sell into enterprise? Is it like a revenue number when they hit a revenue number, or is it more about when they want to launch a different product?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, we actually went through this experience with HotDoc, essentially. So HotDoc being Australia's largest patient engagement platform, I remember we initially sold to one-person GP clinics. Like when we very first started, it was very, very small customers. And then we kind of moved up market, essentially. But we realized to kind of as far as I guess in that specific market, we really need to move to enterprise because enterprise had, certain enterprises, I guess medical groups essentially had 300 clinics. So we could, by having that one sale, we could automatically be in those 300. So I think as far as the right time, I mean, if the strategy is to start with SMBs and eventually move up to enterprise, I think it's really going to become pretty clear when the business is A, in a position technically, or the product is in a position technically to be able to get into enterprise. And B, you need to build some kind of groundswell and credibility with SMBs if that's your strategy before you hit enterprise. So I think it's kind of one of those nuanced approaches, but I think it's when the product is ready to serve the enterprise market, which is a very different market to the SMB market. And also, how competent are you and how many references do you have to be able to actually sell into the enterprise market? So I think that's kind of based on those two factors.
Got it. And last couple of years, I would say 2022 to 24 have been a little tough for the SaaS industry. But do you think most of that spending would go from SaaS to AI, or do you think it's like the end of the SaaS model as per se?
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, looking at some really interesting stats, basically, it's about $290 billion a year is spent on B2B SaaS
Yeah,
globally
right.
versus B2B services is actually about 6.1 trillion. So
Well,
to put things in perspective, 22 times the amount that's spent on SaaS is actually spent on services, essentially. So I don't think necessarily SaaS is going to, decline in growth per se. I think it's going to still kind of increase over time. But where the real opportunity for AI comes in is to actually eat up some of that services market, essentially. And I think that's where it's a really exciting opportunity. And yeah, I mean, SaaS naturally sits side by side with services because there's certain things that SaaS can do that services can't, essentially, and kind of vice versa. But where AI comes in and where it's super exciting and where we're entering the space with Vance is that whole, can a AI essentially, provide a service to the same level that a human would, either a human at a service company or a human that works internally at an organization. So that's kind of, hopefully that answers at least my perspective on what's going to happen there.
got it. Interesting. And again, when it comes to AI, what do you think is the end state for the foundation model layer?
I mean, that's a super good question. I mean, there's still hallucinations with these foundation models. I mean, they're getting better and better, but ultimately, there still are hallucinations, and you do have things like knowledge graphs and stuff like that. But there is going to be a turning point where you can actually trust a core foundation model potentially more than a human. I don't think right now you can do that. But as far as I think in the next few years, absolutely that would be the case. Where it kind of lacks, though, is the strategic element. So I think AI is going to be very, very good at giving very accurate responses and providing accurate services. But, for example, with lawyers and accountants, they are very strategic, and you need that strategic element because not everything is black and white,
Yeah,
essentially. AI is probably very good at things that are black and white, but there's things that are kind of slightly gray, where a strategic element comes in. That strategic reasoning, is AI going to be the right, will it get to the point where they'll be able to do that? Unsure. But for the vast majority of, I guess, work, AI is going to perform it, I mean, realistically better than a human in a lot of ways. Yeah.
got it, got it. And do you think we'll see a specialization of models, and will they be like different models be used for different things?
Well, you think so, right? I mean, there's more and more models coming out, basically, and the barriers to entry to actually create a model are significantly lower. I mean, ultimately, it's going to come down to, I guess, are there going to be specialist models? Well, I think it's going to come down to the data sets. And I think that, potentially to even protect, I guess, specific data sets that some businesses may have, they might from scratch want to create their own model, essentially. So I think you're going to see kind of more, I guess, kind of these new foundation models coming out that don't necessarily, rely on the big foundation models because of the concerns around privacy that are there. So I think you'll see an increase of people being able to create them themselves or using open source tools versus actually just using, I guess, the core foundation models. That's kind of at least my view, but who knows?
Got it. And do you think there's a room for a new foundation model to be born? And do you think it's going to be VC backable?
Yeah, I mean, different verticals. I think when it comes to VC backable, I mean, that's interesting because I mean, the amount of VC capital that's already got into a lot of these foundation models is insane. I mean, the incumbents in the market definitely have a strategic edge. They've got access to the data. And, if you can create a foundation model that has access to the right data, then you're in a far better position, essentially. But it will come down to the data sources. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see a lot of the existing incumbent SaaS businesses, for example, creating their own potential foundation models, whether it's beneficial to them to even invest in that as a strategic difference, or whether they're better off just licensing and using a pre-existing foundation model. Yeah, it does come down to the data and how it's going to be protected. But as technologies evolve over time, naturally, a lot of these things have become more and more open source, essentially. So the barriers to entry to be able to create a model. So whether it's VC backable, I think the application layer is still super interesting as far as VC investments. And I think the VCs are probably going to be looking at extremely good user cases versus kind of the core technologies and another foundation model. But there's all these ecosystem plays that I think could be really big around, I guess, like LangChain and stuff like that. Yeah.
Correct. And how much money do you think is needed to build a foundation model today?
I mean, that's probably going beyond my technical expertise, to be honest. But I mean, it probably less and less than before. I mean, the thing is, a lot of the research is open source now. So probably much less. I mean, potentially you could maybe even spin up a foundation model. I mean, we may even look to create a foundation model at Vance, and we're a very small company, But at the same time as well, there's this kind of, I guess, there's this big debate in tech with tech leaders, and I found this with working with different CTOs. And some CTOs are like, let's build it ourselves
Mm.
versus let's license it. So it really comes down to speed. And I guess, yeah, building a foundation model is probably, it takes time. And you have to train the data and to make it compete on performance as well, because you're dealing with hardware as well. You're dealing with, a lot of different elements. So if a company was to actually say, I'm going to create a core foundation model from scratch and go up against the kind of, incumbents that are there, I mean, it's ambitious. They'd have to have a very unique, differentiator.
Correct. And recently, there's somebody called Anu, who said there's going to be a rise of software creators where there's going to be 100x number of softwares being launched because of AI.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and do you think
Yeah.
I've been on the revenue side of the business and I've always been scared of product, but how do you think with AI the sort of we'll see an exponential rise in products, and how would you go about differentiating a product from others?
That's a super, super good point. Now, you're actually seeing something insane happening where, the barriers to entry and the costs and the speed to actually get a product up and running is significantly lower than it was in the past. And you're seeing a lot of these copycat companies come along. So there's a bunch of these companies that have come along, and what they're doing is they're basically saying, we'll basically provide the exact same, solution at 90% less price, basically. So you're seeing
Mm.
these companies going up against companies like, like Calendly and all these different kind of SaaS tools. And basically they're able to literally replicate a pre-existing SaaS solution and say, it's exactly the same. It's feature parity. They managed to build in a few months instead of several years of R&D. And basically then they can offer that to customers at a low cost. So you're seeing that basically. And I think that's where with SaaS, the defensibility of SaaS is gonna change over time, because pure software, it's the value in the software is probably going to be less valuable and less defensible. And that's where I think there's an opportunity for AI companies to come in. I mean, that's why our strategy with Vance is very much around actually being able to we're not creating a SaaS solution at all. What we're doing is we're basically creating software that basically has access to a foundation model. We're also using some traditional techniques of software development and tools, as well as, I guess, using foundation models and computer vision and LLMs and the like, because that puts you in a more defensible position, essentially. And if you've got the right, data points and data labeling and stuff like that, that makes it more defensible than just purely having a data sets and schemas, also databases and schemas, which ultimately is what a SaaS solution is, essentially. So I think that's where we're going to see the shift. And yeah, being smart about it and having access to the right data labels and having that combination, almost that hybrid of like SaaS and AI to provide an outcome and a service That's where the kind of differentiator is, because it's much harder to create an outcome for a customer than it is to say, here's a bit of software that you use to get an outcome. And that's traditionally what SaaS has been. But if you're saying, here's software that's going to provide you with an outcome, well, that's potentially a lot harder to do, but it's also more defensible.
Got it. Interesting. And when you were building Vans, how did you get to decide what is the ICP? If I'm not wrong, you're looking to,
Yeah.
sorry, speak of VCs and venture studios, but how do you get to define the right ICP then?
Yeah, I mean, SMBs basically. I mean, as mentioned earlier, love the SMB market, and I think there's really an opportunity and a gap here to really help SMBs.
Yeah.
The thing about SMBs is SMBs, can vary anywhere between, I guess, one person to, two, three, four, 500 people, So it's a kind of that's pretty broad. We're more targeting obviously people between potentially around 5 to 100 employees initially, but I guess they're the companies that have government obligations, that actually have obligations they have to meet, but don't necessarily have the big resources that a lot of larger companies have. So they don't have full, admin teams, that have full, ops and finance teams. We're targeting companies that are kind of transitioning to the point where they're having so much demand in the obligation space that they might need to hire somebody. And that's where we come in. And that's how we define that ICP, by the need essentially, and the stage and the resource they have access to.
Got it. And uh, uh, Simon, you built multiple successful businesses. Especially when you're looking to grow, you're looking at different growth channels. When do you get to decide when to diversify your growth channels, and when should you focus on one growth channel and when should you diversify?
Yeah, I mean, that's a super interesting question. I mean, there's two parts to this, I guess. One part is geographic expansion. The other one's, I guess, channel.
Yeah.
I think it's important to have I mean, channel fit is the same as product market fit, in
Hmm.
the sense that you're testing different channels and you're finding the right channel. And it really comes down to, I guess, what kind of suits the business. I mean, you're either kind of a fully sales-led motion, basically, or
Yeah.
you're a PLG
Yeah.
motion. So it really comes down to, I guess, those different channels. I mean, all those different kind of, I guess, techniques essentially. But when it comes to channels, I mean, I'm a big believer, if you are running a company that you really do want to leverage, whether you're doing a sales-led motion or product-led motion, obviously partnerships and leveraging pre-existing audiences is really, really good. I mean, if you take a lot of companies that kind of, you look at the breakdown, I think Lenny's newsletter actually broke down somewhere in an article all the different kind of, I guess, channels. A lot of startups pick a specific channel, whether it be, for example, partnerships, and then they leverage that channel, or they create a network effect by having different types of partners. It really comes down to which is most effective. But I'm a believer that if something's effective, really go deep into that, versus really trying to spread thin. And I mean, if you're finding that there's opportunities in maybe other channels, or your limitations on growth through those kind of channels, then always good to. But I'm also a believer as well that no channel is as good at selling. So you have companies that resellers, for example, a lot of the time. That's another kind of very more traditional sales model. Reseller models, they can never sell something as well as you can, essentially. So,
Yeah.
but that is an option. I mean, if you're casting the net, you might look at those channels, even though the margins might be slimmer. But ultimately, if we look at all of this and break it down, it all comes down to CAC to LTV ratio. So quality of customers, which channels are providing the highest quality customers, and what are you seeing as the best kind of LTV or retention from the customer base. So I think that the kind of narrowing down that question, it's what is the quality of the customers that are coming from each channel, and that's the most important part, and double down on the channel that provides the highest quality, not even the highest number, the highest quality customers, which is very key.
Interesting. And I want to talk about hiring. What are some of the common reasons founders fail at hiring, especially at a very early stage where the first 10 to 50 employees are really important?
Yeah, I mean, they're super important. I first of all think that everybody in the company should have ownership, accountability, ownership, which I think is very, very important. And I think that things are changing. And I think Sam Altman actually said something very interesting. He actually said that he believes that in the future there's going to be billion-dollar companies that have 10 employees, or
Yeah.
billion-dollar companies with one employee. And I do genuinely believe in that. My model now with Vance is I'm trying this whole new model, which is basically around having a really small, really competent core team that's very hands-on and very strategic, but then outsourcing or automating what you'd traditionally be hiring for, essentially. So when it comes to decisions of hiring, traditionally companies, especially VC-backed companies, are like, we need to hire, we need to hire, we need to hire. They create job descriptions for gaps in the business to hire somebody. Whereas I think where the opportunity, or where I think kind of things are heading is, well, why not have a competent strategic core group of people that are basically the core, team members, but then outsource to freelancers, contractors that you can embed into the organization and you can bring them in and out. And also automate. I mean, AI, leverage AI, leverage services, and I think that's a much better model, and a model you can probably scale much more quickly, because hiring is a limitation on growth. I genuinely believe that.
Interesting. And how do you get to know if a a new hire isn't working out, and how do you manage that?
That's a really good point. I mean, so first of all, I think that when it comes to, I guess, a team member, there's really two elements. One is their performance, essentially. How are they performing? What is their output ultimately?
Yeah,
I like to have very clear outputs, OKRs. I think that's incredibly important, especially with remote teams. But other pieces, do they contribute in a positive way to the company culture? For
yeah,
me, that is so important. That's the number one. Because if they're contributing positively to the company culture, that is so incredibly important. And for me, I'd almost look at, if they're not contributing to the company culture positively, that's a massive red flag. And that means that, they probably won't work out. So there's the competency piece, which is, are they going to be able to actually perform? Are they the type of person that likes to work autonomously, and the type of person that actually is very hungry? And are they going to provide a good cultural fit to the organization? For me, that's the most important. I've got a saying that, why hire competent assholes? That's just going to ruin your company culture. And company culture is king.
yeah. No, absolutely. Uh, and I want to talk about a product, especially the CEO is the product, but when it comes to creating product vision, what are some of the components which every product vision should include?
Yeah, I mean, product is, it's at the core of, really it's the core of everything that I guess, businesses do. I mean, take Airbnb's strategy, just for example, is that they feel as though designers, they kind of restructured their org, so designers kind of very much leading product. And I kind of do believe in that. I mean, the truth about it is that product is very much defined by the customers and the customer's needs. And I think that the people that are closest to the customer are the ones that really should be defining the product as much as possible. And designers like to interact. I think it's important that product managers interact and having an organization where you can have the actual people that are customer facing working extremely closely with, I guess, the people that are building out the product. But then there's also the strategic side as well, which is one thing that, what the customers need, but what actually makes sense strategically, and what is defensible essentially. And I go through this a lot. I mean, with Vance, I'm very deep in the product,
Yeah,
looking at the strategy, and I'm kind of taking my experience from the past of some mistakes that we've made and really focusing on, well, let's focus on one thing at a time. Let's move really, really quickly, and let's ship really, really quickly, and deeply listen to customers. Because I do think there's a naivety out there, which is, we think we know what the customer wants. Let's just go and do it, versus talking to the customers. So there's both element, the defensibility of what you're creating, as well as the needs of the customers. They're really the two main things. Ultimately, other than that, everything else is kind of second tier, in my opinion.
mm, got it. And there are a lot of listeners who haven't reached a product market fit, and you have done it a couple of times in your career. How should pre-product market fit founders set their North Star metric? What is the one thing they should focus on at least the first year or so?
Yeah, so I mean, Sequoia actually released a really interesting article. You may have seen that around the product market fit. Actually, my cousin who works at Sequoia, he was actually deeply involved in that article, and it's a really really good. I guess there's different levels of need and demand, and that's product market fit is, how much demand is there from the market, and where does it fit? Is it something that's urgently needed, or is it something that's nice to have, but organizations are going to adopt it? Those kind of things. I mean, finding product market fit, first of all, the definition of product market fit varies.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a pretty broad areas, but typically it just means that it's customers adopting it. There's low churn. Customers want it. Customers are seeking you out to get it. I think they're the kind of the key metrics. But yeah, I mean, as far as actually, I guess, products, it's just iterations. And one thing that I think that a lot of the smartest tech people I know and the smartest VCs that I know talk about is it's shipping quickly and moving quickly, basically, because you
yeah,
won't ultimately find that unless you're shipping quickly, moving quickly, ultimately. So to those people that are looking to find product market fit, make sure there's a demand, make sure there's a need in the market, but also just over service that need and work really quickly and ship quickly and show value. And there's either two ways of doing it: show constant incremental value, where you're constantly incrementally adding value to the point where you've got as a whole value, or you're basically so deep in, the value you can create and knowing that very clearly. So yeah, that's kind of my approach to that. And but yeah, I mean, that's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. And sometimes when companies think that product market fit, they don't necessarily. Or they might have a small segment of the market that has that need, but not the whole market. So it also comes to market sizing and looking at different types of customers. And also that's why it's important to test with certain different types of customers, to see if there's value across the board, or whether it's, a tiny cohort of customers might see the value in the product market fit.
Got it, got it. And the founder is not able to find the product market fit. When do you think? What's your advice on when should they look at pivoting, or when should they look at closing shop?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. That's a super interesting question. I mean, when is the right time? I mean, obviously, are they running out of money is one piece,
Yeah,
that's one way to look at it. I think pivoting is interesting. I mean, pivoting is an interesting word as well, because you can do a mega pivot or you can do a minor pivot. I think it's just I think that what will dictate this is just talking to customers. I think that, just talk to customers, talk to customers, talk to customers. And I think that, knowing, depending on how customers respond and how they're using your offering really dictates, I guess, that. But yeah, if you run out of money, that's one piece, but that doesn't necessarily mean you need to give up necessarily. You just need to have the right signals in place that there's a better opportunity that you think you can own, or is there an opportunity for you to kind of keep going down your track? But it's a very tough question, right? That one, honestly, and it's one that case by case is very, very different, because there's a lot of companies that got to the point where they were about to give up, and then
yeah,
suddenly, they saw an opportunity, So I think pivoting is more seeing an opportunity. That's how I look at pivoting. There's a better opportunity here. Let's change course
yeah.
versus, kind of, and sometimes, yeah, if you just keep on throwing money at something, it doesn't necessarily, or you keep kind of iterating on a product, there's times where it just doesn't make a difference
Hmm.
because the core value is not there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. So, and there's been a playbook for SaaS startups. You look at SEO, content, partnerships, outreach, to get your first 100 odd customers. But with AI coming in, it's become easier for people to replace junior developers and use AI, and it's making senior developers more efficient. But what advice would you give to founders to differentiate themselves in a competitive market? Like, like you have AI tools which can churn out, I don't know, 100 SEO articles, and can build product faster. But what is it makes them different in a very competitive market?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. The whole SEO piece. I mean, right now you have those tools you mentioned, especially outbound as well. You have all these outbound automated SDRs essentially. So
Yeah.
everything is becoming more and more crowded and more noisy essentially. So I think that looking at alternative techniques is probably going to be pretty important. I mean, foundationally, you do need to do outbound. Foundationally, you do need to do, all the link building. You need to do all the SEO side of things and stuff like that. But it's how do you differentiate? I think that it's leveraging pre-existing customers, is incredibly important, and building the right partnerships. I think so. In this type of market where you've got these low barriers to kind of use tools to grow the business that are inexpensive, I think that that's going to become saturated. And I think what's going to become more meaningful is customers are going to start making decisions based on what other customers like them are doing, as well as basically, partners that are actually recommending to them essentially. So I think that, I think it's very important now, especially that there's so much noise out there, to
Yeah.
kind of, leverage customer referrals and to also work, leverage partnerships as well.
Interesting. And Simon, what is the future for Vans? What are you looking to build this year and the next couple of years?
Yeah, with Vance, I mean, we're very, very ambitious with Vance. What we see the opportunity really being is, as I mentioned, government obligations, and government obligations is probably the biggest stakeholder that a business has is the government, essentially. Probably more
Mm.
important in a lot of ways to a certain extent than the shareholders in the business or suppliers, because you have to do things for the government. If you don't, you're going to be in trouble. And there's all these little things that businesses need to have, essentially. So I guess the future for Vance and what we're really focusing on now is how can we create a personalized single source of truth to businesses that has all their government obligations listed, and how can then we perform at Vance perform those tasks and perform those obligations for businesses in a way that they can kind of trust that their back office is being taken care of, so they can really focus on the growth and on the product or the service that they're offering essentially. So what does the future look like? I mean, we're kind of doing it in layers essentially, but really what we want to do is, we get to the point where 95% of administrative tasks at businesses to do with business obligations are performed by Vance, essentially. So significantly reducing the costs for businesses to outsource basically or to do their obligations and admin. And also giving them peace of mind that they don't really have to think about it. I think that's one thing being a business founder myself, is that always kind of thinking about, well, what are the obligations? Am I missing anything? You've got all these little distractions, like little mosquitoes biting you constantly. How can we remove that burden from businesses? And to be honest, who enjoys doing a lot of the admin around business obligations? I haven't met a single person, not even an accountant, that enjoys doing that. So it's what does the future look like for us? Well, removing all that tedious, time-consuming, admin-y stuff around business obligations, and automating that, and doing it in a way that's better than it's ever been done. And it's much lower cost than it currently costs to do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are a lot of opportunities because, a lot of doctors also spend a lot of time on admin work and they don't want to do it, but there's no way around it, especially in NHS here in the UK. But,
Yeah.
yeah,
There's 100%. I mean, there's so many amazing companies that are kind of entering this space, and there's quite a few that, especially for doctors, because the amount of admin that's involved. And admin does remove, you're taking the precious time of someone like a doctor. And for
yeah,
them to do admin just does not make sense, absolutely not. For businesses as well, any type of small business, like whether you're a cafe or whether you're a service provider, or whether you're a gym or whether you're a startup, all these businesses should be focusing on actually doing their core offering, providing the best service, the best product, growing their business, not having to deal with all these different admin obligations. And I think it's across the board. Every business feels these obligations, and it really does kind of almost make it harder to run a business than actually easier.
yeah, no, absolutely. Um, Simon, I quickly want to do the top three. What's your favorite business book?
Okay, so top three business book is basically, it's actually, so there's obviously quite a few books out there that are, really I guess, yeah, I mean, that's solid. But there's actually the Business Harvard Review, Communication for Business, for me, is actually one of the best books I've ever read, because what I learned is that in business, getting to the point as quickly as possible, whether it be you messaging a customer or an investor, or you messaging a coworker or a supplier, communicating in the simplest, most concise way possible has really yielded the best results in any business book that I've actually read, essentially. Because a lot of the business books are theoretical and they're practical, but this is the hyper practical book, basically, and I read it a while ago, but I think it's the Harvard Business Review communication book. It's one of the first books I read, because I realized, there we go. I think it's Business Communication. Business Communication by Harvard Business School of Press. Incredibly important book that I've read. So what was the other question?
So we'll put that in the show notes. And if you could go back in time when you started your entrepreneurial journey, what is the one thing you would have focused on or done thing differently?
Yeah, that's a super good question. Embracing the struggle. I think that, back then I always looked into the future and always thought, well, if I work really, really hard right now, I'm going to be able to be more successful in the future. I think it's important that entrepreneurs actually embrace the struggle and enjoy the journey as much as possible, because you're going to, whatever point of success you get to, you're going to be reminded, and you're going to want that kind of that struggle again a little bit. So I think that's one piece. That's probably the kind of one of the biggest changes. I would have been, told myself, embrace the struggle. This is good. This you're gonna miss this one day. I think that's one piece, and yeah.
Correct. And what's your favorite online tools? Example, Gmail, Slack, Zoom.
I mean, to be honest, Notion is the holy grail for me. I adore Notion. I think it's the best tool out there. It is phenomenally amazing, and use it all the time. And just another quick one, actually, just before and I mean, there's a lot of different, tools out there that, kind of use regularly. But I want to touch on one thing that's actually the best bit of business advice I've ever received. And it's
Yeah.
by far the best bit of business advice. Didn't actually come from a business person. This came from my older brother, who's an architect. And we were
Nice.
talking about design and architecture. And I just asked him, I'm a very curious person. I always ask people a ton of questions. And I asked him, different challenges and stuff like that. He has a business. And he actually said in design, the best designs come from constraints. So basically, constraints equals opportunity. Same in design. If you're an architect and you have building permits, you're going to do restrictions. That sometimes creates the best buildings because by having constraints, you come up with the best designs, and that's how innovation comes. And that's something that I think businesses is really, really good in the mindset I always have is that, yes, if a business has certain constraints that they have to work with, turn those constraints into opportunities. Come up with different, innovation based on those constraints. So I think that's definitely the best bit of business advice is that constraints can equal the best opportunities.
Yeah, no, absolutely love it. It totally makes sense. And Simon, what are the best way people can reach out to you and know more about Vance?
So they can visit Vance, which is hirevance, HIREVANCE.com, hirevance.com. And more than welcome to email me directly or follow me on LinkedIn. And my email is Simon, SIMON, @hirevance.com.
Awesome. We'll put that in the show notes. Simon, thank you so much for taking your time and speaking to us. I really enjoyed my conversation with you.
No problem at all. Thank you so much.